A coder catches a documentation gap 2 months after the visit. Is fixing it a routine correction, or is this the kind of retroactive edit that gets the entire claim flagged? I'm Tony, and my job is basically being the person who catches the gap between what happened in the room and what ended up on the claim. So I'd like to welcome you back to Help for Docs, where we cover CDI, medical coding, HCC risk adjustment, and revenue cycle education for providers, coders, CDI specialists, and clinical documentation professionals. Today, we're drawing a hard line between a correction that's completely defensible and an edit that can put an entire claim at risk. And this is coming straight from CMS's own record-keeping rules. But first, the obligatory disclaimer. Remember, this is educational content and it's not legal or compliant advice for your organization. You know that coding rules shift. So please always check your current CMS, AHIMA, AAPC, and ACDIS guidance. And remember to include your compliance officer when something is not totally clear for you. Um, This is all meant as an introduction. Before you make any changes, you should dig into the topic. So there are 3 legitimate ways that CMS gives coders and providers to fix a record. And you'll find them in the Medicare Program Integrity Manual. A late entry adds something that the provider actually knew and did at the time, but didn't remember to write it down or didn't write it down for whatever reason. So it does require total recall, and then they need a current date and signature. They can't backdate this. An addendum would supplement the record with any genuinely new information that wasn't available yet, like, for example, a lab result that came in late. An amendment is a correction of something that's inaccurate. So when we do that, we have to preserve the original content, and then clearly show what's changed. EMRs will do that for us now, but in the old days with paper charts, it was just a simple strike through and a rewrite. All 3 of these exist, all 3 are fine, but we do run into some trouble depending on how they get used. So here's a little clue on what auditors are actually looking for. So a correction clarifies or completes the documentation of something that did already happen and it was clinically true. But it doesn't change what was billed, it just makes the record match up to reality more accurately. Now, a retroactive edit, that's different, okay? When a change gets used to justify a service or the code level after the fact, and it's often after the claim was already submitted or even after it's already been questioned. And CMS is explicit about this, okay? Late entries are not intended to recreate memory or, justify any services retrospectively. So just remember that single sentence is the whole test. So what does CMS say makes a correction defensible? It has to be clearly and permanently identified as an amendment, correction, or a delayed entry. You can't just sneak it in, quietly blend it into the original text like it had been there all along. It needs the current date of the change and the identity of who made it, not the original date of service. Okay. The original content needs to be preserved. We can't just delete it. so that the reviewer can see what was said before and what was said after. And there also has to be, they have to be able to tell reliably what was the original content and what was the modified content. So if you skip any of these requirements, you're going to be hearing from the MACs, the certain recovery auditors, because they are instructed to not even consider these entries. So take note of this. CMS doesn't give you like a hard deadline for when the correction is too late, but the guidance is still pretty clear in the whole spirit of it. Like entries made weeks or months after the fact are, and this is their words, they're likely to be treated as justifiably suspect. Okay? So post-service documentation can just inherently carry that heightened audit risk. And even more so, especially when it's being used to support payment after the claim has already gone out. Or, if they see that it's going to increase payment, that's gonna draw their attention, right? So the lack of a hard deadline is not a loophole, though. Don't think of it that way. It just means that timing becomes part of how the reviewer is looking at and judging your intent. Alongside, they're not just looking at the content of the change itself, but they want to try to understand why you made this change and what your intention was. Okay, so we have a couple scenarios we can look at here, and they do look kind of similar, on the surface anyway. In our first one, the coder notices that the note leaves out laterality on an exam the provider clearly performed, right? The provider adds a signed dated late entry the same week, and they're specifying left knee. It's not changing the code that was billed. So that's a defensible correction. Okay, because it's not changing it, there's nothing to be concerned in terms of defense. It's just giving more information. Okay. In the second one, the audit flags a visit as underdocumented for the level that was billed. So 2 months later, there was a detailed exam finding that shows up in the note that wasn't there before. And there's nothing else in the record to back that up. So this is the kind of pattern that CMS's guidance is warning us about. Okay, that entry just exists to justify a service retrospectively rather than to clarify something that was already true. So that's a little weaker place to be in. And that's all there is to it. But as always, when I find some of this information, I like to back it up through other sources. So I found this in several places. I like to point to the regulatory bodies most importantly. So here we have CMS, Noridian, Noridian, and then some pretty good other resources too, educational. So if you really want to dig into this, these are some places you can go. Okay, so just a reminder of the one thing I'd like you to take from this. The correction clarifies what was already true. It should, okay? A retroactive edit tries to justify what wasn't documented in the first place. So that's the difference between a correction and a retroactive edit. And remember, CMS's rules do draw that distinction very clearly. So that's what you should keep in mind. And if your team needs help building on your documentation practices to help them hold up under review, uh, you're welcome to reach out to me on the contact form on helpfordocs.com. And that can be CDI, HCC, risk adjustment, auditing, physician education, anything like that we can help you with. I want to thank you for watching. I hope to see you in the next one, and sure would appreciate if you'd help us to get this out there. Hopefully, the information we're sharing can be helpful to other coders and providers and, office managers, everybody out there. And help to avoid some of these troubles. And the best way to do that is, of course, you know what to do. Okay. I'll make sure you get that subscribe and um, subscribe button. And if you just click like, that'll help the algorithms get it sent out also. All right.